This day has finally come. Before you is a story we've been wanting to tell for a long time. And trust me, it's absolutely worth it. And today, our channel is going to live one full day in the skin of a real, honest-to-goodness Viking. You're finally going to learn who these people actually were. Were they really filthy, wild brutes, the way pop culture often paints them? Or were they curious explorers with rich traditions, clever technology, and an unbelievable ability to survive anywhere on Earth? As always, we'll break down a few myths, tear apart several well-known legends, and share facts that will make your hair stand on end, even on your fingertips. By the way, did you know that Vikings reached North America almost 5 centuries before Columbus? And that's just the warm-up, so stick around. Our main character today is Harald Eirikson. The year is 844, and Harald is standing on a hill looking down at a small Scandinavian village near the old trading hub of Hythabu, on the territory of modern-day Germany, not far from the Danish border. And yes, you heard that right. When an American hears the word Viking, the first thought is usually Norway, maybe Sweden at best. But Denmark has just as much claim to being the homeland of the Vikings. Hythabu was one of 3 major Viking cities mentioned throughout the sagas. The other 2 were in Norway and Sweden. Finland, on the other hand, was never truly Viking land. The people there lived independently, and Vikings only occasionally dropped by. Let's say, not always in the friendliest way. But before we follow Harald any further, let's answer a simple question. Who exactly were the Vikings? In the narrow definition, they were seafaring raiders who, from the 8th to the 11th century, traveled across half the known world. And that's not an exaggeration. Chronicles mention them near the Persian Gulf, along the coast of Africa, and of course, in North America. In a broader sense, Vikings refers to the peoples of Scandinavia, groups with their own states, customs, and worldview. They were not a united empire like Rome, more like a collection of tribes linked by language, culture, and the sea. Sometimes Baltic tribes that raided by sea are also grouped under Vikings because the term describes more the lifestyle than a nationality. The word Viking itself comes from Old Norse, and historians still debate what it originally meant. In Rus, they were called Varangians. In Latin texts, Normans and English writers rarely bothered to distinguish them at all, calling nearly every northern raider a Dane. There's also an interesting detail, one particularly loved by American DNA researchers. Genetically, ancient Vikings were closer to Central Europeans and Northern Slavic populations than to modern Scandinavians. But that topic is still evolving, so we'll leave it for later. One thing we know for sure, the myth that Vikings were illiterate savages doesn't hold up at all. The runic alphabet was a fully developed writing system used for over 1,000 years. Some Swedish villages kept using runes all the way into the 20th century. The Skåne law code, written in runes, is well studied, and historians have no doubt Vikings had a solid writing tradition. Let me steal just a couple of seconds. We might not see each other again. So if you're enjoying this kind of content, hit that subscribe button and give the video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Thanks, and let's keep going. Now, back to Harald Eirikson. Vikings were a deeply religious people, although their beliefs were very different from the familiar ones today. Children were often named after gods, hence names like Thor, Ran, Ragna, or Thorbrand. The female name Inga, by the way, comes from that same era and is still common among Americans with Scandinavian roots. Harald, according to tradition, was named after an ancient god of the sea. Later, a legendary Viking king, said to have spoken with Odin himself, would carry the same name. His last name, Eirikson, is much simpler. It just means son of Eirik. Have you seen the Marvel films? Thor's last name there is Odinson. That's pretty much how Scandinavians did it. Take the father's name, add son, and boom, you've got a surname. That's how names like Eriksson, Thorsteinsson, and dozens of others appeared. And in Iceland, this tradition still exists. Many Americans can't help smiling when they look at the Icelandic soccer roster. It's filled with somebody's son. Daughter's got the ending, daughter. So in one family, you could easily meet a Sigurdsson and a Sigurddaughter, Bruder and Schwester, if we borrow a bit of German. This naming system made it crystal clear which family someone belonged to. Family, for Vikings, was sacred, far more important than wealth, rank, or titles. Harald Eirikson looks almost like an ordinary medieval farmer, except for one important detail. The land he works on actually belongs to him, and that mattered a lot. The Vikings had a strict system that forbade selling land to just anyone. If a family went bankrupt, the right to buy that land first always went to relatives. This rule is part of what kept Scandinavian society from falling into the same feudal trap that swallowed most of Europe. Vikings usually lived in large family groups. Under one roof, you'd often find a grandfather, parents, children, and sometimes even their newly formed families. To make that possible, they built long wooden houses, divided them into rooms, and kept a central hearth where everyone gathered in the evenings to cook, talk, or simply share stories after a long day. Everyday life itself was, well, painfully simple. Sheep, oats, barley. That was the foundation of their survival. Everyone worked in turns, doing whatever was needed just to make it through another season. Remember, we're talking about the far north here. Growing wheat is almost impossible. Even today, only about 3% of Norway's land is suitable for farming. In Sweden, it's around 9%. And in Iceland, barely 1%. And that explains why Vikings went raiding so often, and why they chose the sea as their main road. Geography practically forced their hand. Picture this: mountains, fjords, slippery trails. For Harald, it was far easier to walk down to the shore, hop into a boat, and reach Uncle Svein in the next village by water than spend hours climbing treacherous cliffs. The Romans saw the sea as a source of danger, pirates, storms, unpredictable tides, but Scandinavians felt the opposite. For them, a ship meant life itself, travel, trade, and a chance to get beyond their isolated valleys. Every respectable family either owned a boat or had strong ties with someone who did. Without that, survival was nearly impossible. And here we reach the first big myth, one built up by TV shows and medieval propaganda. Take the series Vikings, where it seems like these guys spend all day chopping each other to pieces. That's pure fiction. Sure, Viking communities didn't have perfectly written legal codes, but for an unjustified killing, a person could be exiled, the worst punishment in Viking society. And in some cases, the killer could be sent to meet Odin right after his victim. What the series does show correctly, though, is the role of women. And this part surprises American viewers the most. Scandinavians were among the first to create marriage contracts and give men and women surprisingly equal rights for their time. Harald, for example, has a fiancée, Astrid, She lives in a neighboring village, and yes, they genuinely care for each other. But here's the twist. The bride usually chose the groom, not the other way around. A man could be wealthy, well-born, even the son of a powerful jarl, but without a record of bravery and real accomplishments, there would be no wedding. Formally, the head of the family made the final decision. But in reality, no one would give away a daughter without her full consent, not fathers, not older brothers. The reason was simple. A Viking wife wasn't a decorative figure. She managed the entire household while her husband could be gone for months or even years on campaigns. And she raised the children to become warriors. No wonder the legendary King Harald Bearskin used to say, "I chose a woman whose courage my sons would drink with their mother's milk." And that wasn't poetic flair. Women were fully respected members of Viking society. One old Scandinavian law fragment that survived to our time says this: if a man touched a free woman's hand without permission, he owed a fine of 5 marks. 1,000 years ago, and already that much respect for personal boundaries. At weddings, they always drafted an early version of what we'd now call a marriage contract. The groom set aside part of his property for his bride, known as the woman's gift. He also paid a friendship gift, essentially a bride price, to her father. The father in turn sent his daughter off with a dowry. The negotiation process often looked like a business deal, every detail discussed down to the last sheep hair. For Harald Eirikson, all this wedding business was a real headache. Being young wasn't seen as an advantage among Vikings. While Europe sometimes married off 10-year-olds, Scandinavians preferred a union closer to 30. It made sense. A man who reached that age had already proven he could survive war and return home. Younger men died far more often. That's why they often arranged delayed marriages. The couple might be officially engaged now, but the actual wedding could take place years later. And to the show's credit, Vikings got one thing absolutely right. When men went raiding, a woman could take up a sword and lead a group of warriors no worse than any chieftain. They truly lived in a society far more balanced than most people assume. But enough about daily life. Let's finally get to what you've been waiting for, the conquests. It's still the year 844, and Denmark is ruled by the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, the same figure the TV series revolves around. But, as always, Hollywood exaggerates. Historically, Ragnar wasn't some random warrior. He was the son of Sigurd Ring, a former king of Denmark. His title was Konung, essentially a Scandinavian king. Whether Ragnar existed exactly as described in the sagas is still debated, but the campaigns attributed to him, those absolutely happened, including the famous assault on Paris. The mechanics of any Viking campaign were always the same. Harald is at home tending sheep or repairing his roof when a messenger arrives from a nearby village. "We're gathering men. There's a new raid ahead," he says. Harald, along with everyone who can hold a sword with steady hands, loads onto the ship and heads out behind the leader. Sometimes that leader was just the head of the village, but this time it was the Konung himself. To understand what comes next, you have to imagine Europe during those years, a constant state of alarm. In 789, Vikings attacked the English town of Dorset. By 800, they had taken control of the Shetland Islands. And in 844, they plundered Lisbon. Yes, the very city that would later become a major center of ocean trade. For Europe, Viking raids had become so common that people stopped being surprised. Christian chroniclers unlike modern TV shows, didn't really have to exaggerate the Viking threat. Scandinavian war bands genuinely could burn a village to the ground, taking everything down to the last grain of barley. It's no wonder a famous Latin prayer appeared, "Lord, deliver us from the fury of the Northmen." People would mutter it the moment they saw longships on the horizon. There's even a theory, one many American historians appreciate, that Vikings unintentionally pushed Europe toward forming centralized governments. After the fall of Rome, everything was chaos. But under the northern threat, rulers had no choice but to organize, build fortifications, create supply systems, and train proper defenses. Now, let's jump to the year 845. Harald Eirikson, along with thousands of warriors, marches toward the walls of Paris under the command of Ragnar Lodbrok. And before we get to the battle itself, let's break down a couple of myths. The first one, Vikings were dumb, untrained savages. That's only half true. Sure, some raiding groups behaved like simple bandits, but the other half? They were a disciplined tactical force. Otherwise, how could they repeatedly defeat the armies of England, Francia, and other so-called professional militaries? Ragnar even had his own spy network, a real intelligence service. And he was the first to implement a clever strategy. Don't burn the village, take a payout instead. It was just smarter. Burn it down, and it's gone forever. Take gold, leave, and you can return in a few years for another donation. This was exactly the strategy they planned to use under Paris. Now, let's talk about what the TV series got wrong. In the show, Ragnar faked his own death. His body is carried to the gates of Paris, and that's how the Vikings get inside. There is a similar story in Viking lore, but it didn't happen in Paris, and it wasn't Ragnar. It was his son, Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn wanted to outshine his father, so he set his sights on the richest city in Europe. He gathered 62 ships, landed on the Italian coast, and pretended to be dead. His men told the locals that their great leader wished to convert to Christianity before passing away. The funeral procession was allowed into the city, and once the guards relaxed, dead Bjorn jumped out of his wooden coffin, threw open the gates, and the city fell in minutes. The funniest part, the Vikings thought they had captured Rome, but they'd gotten lost and taken the small Italian town of Luna instead. A legendary tactical blunder and a great story for the sagas. Paris, however, was a far more serious affair. Ragnar's scouts brought him critical news. France was being torn apart by internal conflict. 3 different factions were fighting for power. So the Vikings arrived at the perfect moment. The defenders were scattered, and Ragnar, together with Harald's warband, destroyed them with a precise tactical move. They never even entered Paris. King Charles the Bald panicked and chose to pay an enormous ransom instead. So Harald sailed back home with a ship full of silver. And on the return journey, Ragnar's army burned every settlement that refused to pay. Mercy was not part of the business model. Sometimes Vikings waged long sieges, cutting off supplies and waiting for hunger to do the work. And they loved choosing the perfect moment, like attacking during Christian holidays, when villagers were in church and weapons were put aside. That's exactly how they took Luna, as mentioned earlier. So no, the myth that Vikings were just a mindless gang of thugs doesn't hold up. If that were true, they would have never conquered half of Europe. Another popular myth is that Vikings were filthy and unhygienic. Christian writers spent centuries painting them as dirty barbarians. Modern viewers complain about shows where Vikings look like fashion models. but reality was somewhere in between. Harald, for example, had his own beard comb. Archaeologists find Viking combs by the handful at excavation sites. And an English chronicler from the 13th century, a man named John, even complained that Vikings win the hearts of English women too easily because they washed on Saturdays and kept themselves groomed. For medieval Europe, that was practically sci-fi. Though the show does make one funny mistake. Ragnar is clean-shaven. Real Vikings would have mocked him endlessly. A shaved head was for criminals or slaves. A respected warrior wore his hair proudly. It was a symbol of status. As for Harald's future, not everything went smoothly. His second campaign in France was far less successful. Half the army died from simple dysentery, and a second capture of Paris never happened. But discovering new lands? That the Scandinavians did brilliantly. They founded settlements in Iceland and Greenland. We have solid proof of that. And in the early 11th century, Leif Erikson landed in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. After rounding Greenland, Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus, as described in the saga of Eric the Red. There's so much more we could say about Harald Eirikson's life. For instance, Vikings adored cats, the very animals Europe later persecuted as demonic. Ordinary warriors worshipped Thor more often than Odin, and the famous horned helmets? Pure 19th century invention, created for theater, not battle. In truth, Vikings were skilled craftsmen, talented blacksmiths, and people with a deep sense of aesthetics. Most stereotypes about them are just shadows of the past. If you want part 2 of Harald Eirikson's story, drop a comment, leave a like, and let us know. We'll happily continue exploring an era shaped by people who changed the world map forever. See you next time, friends!